Hello and welcome. My name is Miroslav and in this video we are going to take a closer look on a new denoiser in Maxwell Render version 5.2. If you are not familiar with denoiser, it is simply a tool that helps you get rid of noise and save time. So we are going to be taking a look at some example scenes and also comparing the render time with and without denoiser. And by the way, all you will see is based on a CPU rendering. Let's get started with my first example. This is a simple interior of the studio. For lighting I started with a preset from the library, but I did a few adjustments. For example, I loaded a softbox map to soften the edges of this light, and then I changed some values to better suit my needs. I used very basic materials here. Almost every material here is opaque, some of them with textures and bump maps. This is the render without the denoiser after 45 minutes at sampling level 14. This area under the table is most challenging in this situation. As you can see, there is still some noise on the figurine's legs and also on a chair. And this is the render with the denoiser. It took only 16 minutes and the sampling level is 11. But as you can probably see, it's much cleaner. Let's tweak some settings and compare these results side by side. Okay, this scene is definitely better with denoiser. But texture on the floor looks a little bit weird to me because it's too smooth. But overall, I think this is a pretty good render. And this is really a great example of how you can save time and achieve very nice interior renders. Which is good news if you are doing a lot of interiors, because these are usually so heavy to handle, especially if you use more than one type of light source. This is my second scene. It's like a simple product shoot, but instead of direct key lights, I used HDRI of a room for lighting the scene like from the windows. I wanted very natural light and reflection on the object's surface. Here's my bottle in front of the camera. The stainless steel material has some imperfection textures applied, as you can see here and also here in the material editor. It is important for making it look maybe a little bit used or just not perfect like it is right from the factory. It definitely looks more real. And this is the final result without denoiser at sampling level 16.34. It took 1 hour. Here you can see the subtle effect of imperfection textures I mentioned. This render is pretty clean, with nice and visible details. Then I did the same render, but this time with denoiser turned on, and after the same amount of time I got this result at sampling level 13.63. I used the most accurate settings, and the interesting fact here is that I reached only about 1/3 of the benchmark compared with the standard render. It was just a test. I was curious how efficient the new denoiser is. I know that with denoiser, typically I do not need to render as long as I did here. But I am also missing a lot of details, and at this point there's no reason to change the settings for denoiser at all, because the render time does not make a difference. So I tried another render, again with denoiser enabled at each sampling level, but this time with fast option. I thought I might save some time and achieve quite good result, but it took me more than an hour to stop the render, and benchmark dropped from the standard render, which was 1550 to 1280, which is not that bad in comparison with 500 of a previous render. That was really a huge drop in performance. This is comparison between standard render and render with Denoiser, which is quite nice, but even if this render is super clean, it misses all the details, all the imperfection textures I applied. So it is probably not a good idea to use Denoiser in this type of close-up or product-like shoots. This scene is very similar, because I wanted to test this kind of close-ups to find out if the situation is the same, but this time my camera is closer to the subject. For bricks I used two different subsurface scattering materials here, and if you don't know, these translucent materials are the most difficult to render, because Maxwell needs to calculate all the small virtual particles inside of this object and basically simulate the light penetration. I also have a few textures applied, for example normal map for the logo, as you can see. This makes it even harder to render, and as a light source I used just a simple plane. And the results are quite interesting. This is almost at sampling level 11. It took 1 hour and I am pretty happy with this render. Yes, it is still noisy, and it is especially visible in 100% zoom. To compare it with the denoised image after the same time, I've got only sampling level 9. I must mention that I used the most accurate settings with the noise shadow option turned on, so I tried the other options. Here without denoised shadows and with fast option, my goal was to achieve the same sampling level, and it almost happened, but the render time has passed an hour. Then I tried to render only for 35 minutes and the result was pretty good. So yes, you don't need a high sampling level to achieve smooth images, and Denoiser can definitely save some time for you. My last test in this scene was to have Denoiser enabled at the end, and the result was basically the same, as you can see. So let's compare our standard render side by side with the best Denoiser result, which is for me the render that saves most of the time and still offers a clean image. What do you think? For me, this looks just too perfect, and that's unnatural. Of course I can tweak a few settings. Well, let's do it. Okay, by lowering the settings this result is pretty great, but this image is still sharper, more defined, and I also noticed that the reflection on all denoised images is lower and more dual. Look at all these details here. I think it's a pretty big difference. So I prefer the standard render here, even if there is still some noise. And maybe you are asking why. Don't get me wrong, I really love the new Denoiser, but why it is not turned on by default? Think about it. It's an option, or I should say another tool to help you, but you need to know how to work with your new tool, and noise is not always a bad thing. So let's talk about the noise, or grain. Maybe this depends on a personal preferences or your client criteria, but I believe that the right amount of noise can help you achieve more photorealistic result. And I am not talking about this. All of us will agree that this doesn't look good. First of all, we need to understand what noise or grain in photography is and what causes it. So, what is noise in photography and how can you use it to your advantage? According to Google, the noise is a defect of the sensitivity of the camera to the light. But in Maxwell, the noise is more like a grain, and grain, according to Google, is more like a texture that brings life to your images. In the real world, all cameras, digital or film, produce some degree of visual noise. Usually the noise is understood as an imperfection, but imperfection is something you as a 3D artist probably wanted to add to your scene. While I am talking, I will show you some photos. When you look closer, all of them have some degree of visual noise, and it is visible in classic film cameras also. Very often there is noticeable presence of noise in movies and beautiful cinematic shots. So why would you want to avoid noise in your renders? You want your renders looks photorealistic, right? But that means the renders should be like photos with all the imperfections. That's the reason why it is called photorealism, not just realism or eye realism. You want to simulate the real camera, not your eyes. And you want to achieve photos like renders. That's important to realize. And if you are asking why not to add some noise filter in post-process, of course you can add some noise filter in a post-process software like Photoshop, but it is not the same because it is uniform. In Maxwell, on the other hand, the noise appears more natural. It is more noticeable in dark areas and shadows, exactly the same way as it happens in real cameras. Here I wanted to demonstrate this in Maxwell. This is the render I did. As you can see, the noise is more noticeable around the door. Outside of the room is very clean. Almost you cannot see any noise there. The process is very similar if you compare it, because usually when you are shooting with a real camera in the dark environment, the noise is more visible. And it is the same in Maxwell. The darker the scene is, the more noise you get. Maxwell is absolutely accurate at simulating the exact amount of light rays caught by sensor of your virtual camera. And with combination of response parameter, which is basically the color profile or color shift of the real films or sensors, you can achieve very accurate pictures. You should definitely want the right amount of noise in your images. My last scene is again very simple. I just created low poly ground on which I placed some trees in Rhino, exported the scene to Maxwell Studio, and then I applied Maxwell subdivision modifier and also grass extension. Before I hit the render button, I set the maximum sampling level for this scene, which was 12, because I thought it should be enough, and I was right. The render took about 20 minutes. I played around with simulants, tone mapping adjustments and the response parameter to get this sunrise look, and then I did the same thing but this time with the denoised image. And as you can see, this image from Denoiser is fine, and it only took about half of the time of the original render. But there's a few weird things happening here. For example, for some reason Denoiser made these leaves dark, and changing the settings didn't help. But you will probably want to turn on Denoiser in your exterior scenes to see and compare if it helps you or not. I mean, you should, because it looks like Denoiser can help you and can save a lot of time for you in these kind of situations or scenes. Well, with this in mind, it is important to always work carefully. Denoiser in version 5.2 really is a good way to achieve nice results in some scenes. It's great for interior and probably for some exterior and landscape rendering. Personally, I would not recommend it to use it for close-ups with a lot of details, for example. As a general rule, I would say if you have time to test it, do it. I think it's worth to try and use it at least at the end option basically every time. My name is Miroslav, my duck, and I hope this was useful for you. If you want, feel free to ask me about this topic. I am going to continue testing the new Maxwell Denoiser and will be posting some renders on my Instagram account. Thank you for watching and see you next time.